The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It was early morning in a remote village nestled in the heart of Burkina Faso, a place where time seemed to move at its own unhurried pace. The landscape stretched out in all directions, red earth dotted with acacia trees, their gnarled branches reaching toward the heavens like ancient prayers frozen in time. An unusual silence had descended upon the village, the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums and makes the heart beat faster. The earth still held the moisture from the previous night's rain, creating a thick humidity that clung to everything. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil, vegetation, and something else. Something indefinable that made the skin prickle with unease. On ordinary days, this village would come alive with the symphony of rural life. The cheerful chirping of birds would cascade through the air like musical notes. Children's laughter would echo through the dusty streets as they kicked makeshift soccer balls made from bundles of rags. Women would gather at the communal well, their voices rising and falling in animated conversation as they filled their water containers. Men would prepare their tools for a day in the fields, greeting each other with familiar calls and friendly banter. But today was different. Today, something sinister lurked in the atmosphere, casting an invisible pall over everything. The birds seemed to sense it, remaining quiet in their nests. Even the goats and chickens that usually roamed freely through the village appeared subdued, staying close to their shelters. Near the edge of the village pond, a body of water that had served the community for generations. An elderly farmer named Boubacar stood clutching his worn wicker basket. His weathered hands, scarred by decades of hard labor, trembled slightly as he held it. He had come, as he did every morning for the past 40 years, to check his fishing nets and perhaps catch a glimpse of the silver fish that occasionally broke the surface of the murky water. Fishing was more than a livelihood for Boubacar. It was a meditation, a connection to his father and grandfather who had fished these same waters. But on this particular morning, his sacred routine was shattered by a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a vision that would invade his dreams and steal his peace. There, floating face down in the shallow waters near the reeds, was the body of a woman. Her traditional patterned dress billowed around her like a dark flower in bloom. Her hair spread out like dark seaweed around her head, tangled and matted with mud and pond vegetation. Her arms floated at her sides, fingers slightly curled, as if she had been reaching for something in her final moments. Her face, barely visible beneath the water's surface, bore an expression of frozen terror. Mouth slightly open, eyes staring at nothing, the lifeless form swayed gently with the movement of the water, creating a macabre dance that seemed to mock the very concept of peace. Small fish darted around the body, their presence adding another layer of horror to the scene. The early morning light caught the surface of the water, making it sparkle in cruel contrast to the darkness of what lay within. Boubacar's basket fell from his hands, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. The scream that tore from his throat was unlike any sound he had ever made, a sound of pure, visceral horror. The kind that comes from deep within the soul when confronted with something fundamentally wrong. Something that shouldn't exist in the natural order of things. It was the sound of innocence dying, of safety being revealed as an illusion. Aye! Aye! His voice cracked with terror and grief. Someone help! Please God, someone help! Within moments, villagers came running from all directions, their bare feet pounding against the earth. Women clutched their headscarves to their faces with one hand while lifting their skirts with the other to run faster. Men shouted questions that no one could answer, their voices overlapping in confusion and panic. Children were quickly pulled away from the terrible scene, their curious eyes covered by parental hands, though many had already glimpsed enough to fuel their nightmares. The crowd that gathered at the pond's edge spoke in hushed, frightened tones. Their faces showed the universal human reaction to sudden, violent death, shock, disbelief, and a primitive fear that if death could strike here, so randomly, so viciously, then no one was truly safe. Who is it? Someone asked. Can you see her face? Don't let the children look. Get the chief. Get the village chief. Some villagers covered their mouths with cloth. a gesture both practical and symbolic. Practical to avoid the smell that was beginning to rise from the water, symbolic as if to prevent death itself from entering through their mouths. Others turned away, unable to look, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Everyone trembled with a mixture of shock and fear. An elderly woman named Aminata, respected for her wisdom and spiritual insight, pushed through the crowd. She looked at the body for a long, silent moment, then closed her eyes and began to pray in a low, rhythmic voice. Others joined her, their prayers creating a soft murmur that mixed with the sound of gentle weeping. The village chief, a dignified man in his 60s named Issaka, arrived wearing his ceremonial robe hastily thrown over his sleeping clothes. His face, usually calm and composed, showed deep concern. He organized several young men to carefully retrieve the body from the water, treating it with the respect due to the dead, even as they recoiled from the task. As they laid the body on the bank, covered with a cloth, the full horror became apparent. This was no accident. There were marks on her neck, livid bruises that spoke of strangulation. Her wrists bore deep gouges where rope or wire had cut into the flesh. She had been bound, helpless, before being killed and dumped in the pond like refuse. The news spread through the village like wildfire, each retelling adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Runners were sent to neighboring villages to warn them. Messengers were dispatched to the nearest town with access to telephone lines. Within hours, the tragedy had rippled outward, reaching the ears of district officials, then regional authorities, and finally, like a stone thrown into still water, the waves reached all the way to Ouagadougou, the nation's capital. Local police arrived by late morning, their uniforms crisp despite the dust of travel. They conducted preliminary investigations, taking photographs with old cameras, measuring distances, interviewing witnesses. But as they worked, more horror emerged. Villagers who had been too afraid to go near the pond now came forward with terrible news. There were more bodies. When the police searched the deeper parts of the pond, their worst fears were confirmed. By afternoon, 4 more bodies had been recovered. All women, all showing signs of violence, all disposed of in the same cold, calculated manner. The village had become a scene of unspeakable tragedy. Women wailed in the traditional manner, their ululations of grief echoing across the landscape. Men stood in groups, their faces hard with anger and helplessness. The very foundations of their community had been shaken. Who could do such things? Was the killer among them, hiding behind a familiar face? Or was this the work of outsiders, strangers, who had brought evil into their peaceful world? By evening, a detailed report had been compiled and sent via secure channels to the presidential office in Ouagadougou. The photographs were grim and disturbing, the forensic details even more so. This was not a random act of violence. This was systematic, deliberate, methodical. Someone was hunting the women of this village, and they were doing so with calculated precision and complete disregard for human life or the bonds of community. President Ibrahim Traoré sat behind his heavy wooden desk in the presidential palace, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his office. The room was decorated with symbols of Burkina Faso's history, traditional masks on the walls, a map of the country marked with pins indicating development projects, photographs of President Traoré meeting with village chiefs and international dignitaries. But now, all of that faded into the background as he reviewed the reports from the village. The photographs were spread before him, images that no leader wants to see, evidence of violence against his people, proof that somewhere in his nation, evil was operating with impunity. His jaw clenched as he studied each one, his hands forming fists on the desktop. President Traoré was a man who had come to power promising security and justice for all Burkinabe people. He had served in the military, understood discipline and order, but he also had a deep well of compassion for his country's rural communities. This attack on village women felt personal to him, an assault on the most vulnerable members of society. His chief advisor, Colonel Diallo, stood nearby with several security officials. The mood in the room was tense. Everyone knew that this case would require someone exceptional, someone with not just skill, but also unshakable integrity and determination. The eyes of the nation would soon be upon this investigation, and they could not afford any mistakes. "These are not random killings," President Traoré said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Look at the pattern. All women, all from the same village, all disposed of in the same location. This is someone with a plan, someone with a purpose." He looked up at his assembled advisors. "This is an attack on our people, on our values. Someone is trying to make us feel helpless, to show that even in our own villages we cannot protect our citizens." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "I want this case assigned to our best officer," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Not someone with political connections or seniority. I want the best investigator we have. Nothing must remain hidden. Every stone must be turned, every lead followed. This killer must be brought to justice no matter who they are, no matter where they hide, no matter what it takes." The room fell silent. Several names were mentioned, experienced commanders, well-known investigators, but Colonel Diallo shook his head. "Mr. President, I believe we need someone special for this. Someone who combines investigation skills with a deep understanding of village life and customs. Someone who can earn the trust of the community while conducting a ruthless search for the truth." "Do you have someone in mind?" Traoré asked. "Yes, sir. There's a young officer in the Criminal Investigation Division, Captain Amadou Sankara. He's only 32, but his record is exceptional. Solved 15 major cases in 3 years. More importantly, he grew up in a village much like the one we're dealing with. He understands these communities from the inside. Bring him to me," the president ordered. Minutes later, Captain Amadou Sankara entered the presidential office. He was tall and lean, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to military precision, his posture perfect but not rigid. There was something about him, an intensity that went beyond mere professional dedication. When he saluted, it was with a precision that spoke of respect, not just for rank, but for the institution itself. President Traoré studied him for a long moment. The captain met his gaze steadily, neither deferential nor arrogant. "Good," the president thought. "Confidence without ego." "Captain Sankara," Traoré began, "I assume you've been briefed on the situation in the village?" "Yes, Mr. President. 5 women murdered. Bodies recovered from a pond. Evidence suggests a serial killer operating with knowledge of the area." "Your assessment?" "Sir, whoever is doing this wants to be noticed. They want to create fear, but they also left the bodies where they would be found. That suggests either arrogance or a message. Possibly both. The village will be traumatized, trust will be broken. The investigation needs to restore that trust while pursuing the killer." President Traoré nodded, impressed by the quick analysis. "Captain, I'm placing you in command of this investigation. You'll have full authority to requisition whatever resources you need: personnel, equipment, forensic support. The only requirement is results. This killer must be caught." Captain Sankara stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "Mr. President, give me this responsibility. I will go to the village myself and investigate every detail with my own eyes. I will sleep little, eat less, and work until this monster is caught. I will not rest until the killer is found and justice is served." There was something in his voice, a fervor that went beyond professional duty. President Traoré noticed it, but interpreted it as righteous anger, the kind any decent man would feel in the face of such crimes. "Very well," Traoré said. "This case is under your command. But remember, Captain, this is not just about solving murders. This is about sending a message to whoever did this and to the nation. The killer wants us to be afraid, to feel helpless, to lose faith in our institutions. We will show them. We will show everyone that we are neither afraid nor helpless." "Justice will be done," Captain Sankara saluted sharply. "It will be my honor to serve, Mr. President. The killer's days are numbered." As the captain left to organize his team, Colonel Diallo approached the president. "Sir, do you think he's up to this?" "He's young, relatively inexperienced with cases of this magnitude." President Traoré continued staring at the door through which the captain had exited. "Did you see his eyes, Colonel? There's something there, a fire. Whether that fire will light the way to justice or consume him, I don't yet know. But I believe he's the right man for this. Time will tell." Within the hour, Captain Sankara had assembled a team of 12 officers, forensic specialists, investigators, and support personnel. He briefed them with clinical precision, showing crime scene photographs, explaining what little they knew, laying out his investigative strategy. His team watched him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. There was something about their new commander, an intensity that was both inspiring and slightly unsettling. By late afternoon, the convoy of police vehicles was ready. Four-wheel drive trucks loaded with equipment, personnel, and supplies for an extended stay in the village. Captain Sankara rode in the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind already working through scenarios, theories, possibilities. As they drove through the countryside, the landscape gradually changed from urban sprawl to rural farmland, then to the more remote regions where villages existed in relative isolation. The captain watched it all, memories stirring of his own childhood in a similar place. He remembered the sense of community, the way everyone knew everyone. How safety came not from locks and walls, but from mutual trust and watchfulness. That safety had been shattered in the village they were approaching. His job was to restore it. But beneath his professional determination lay something else, something deeper and more personal that even he didn't fully acknowledge. A wound that had never healed, a pain that had transformed over years into something harder, colder, more dangerous. The sun was setting as the convoy approached the village, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. Captain Sankara looked at those colors and thought of blood, of justice, of debts that demanded payment. Soon, he whispered to himself. Very soon. The convoy of police vehicles rolled into the village as the last light of day faded into twilight. The sound of engines in this normally quiet place was jarring, announcing the arrival of the outside world with its sirens, its uniforms, its authority. But instead of bringing comfort, the presence of so many official vehicles seemed to deepen the village's unease. As Captain Sankara's team approached, the change in atmosphere was immediately palpable. What should have been a lively community going about its evening routines, cooking fires being lit, families gathering for meals, neighbors sharing stories of the day, was instead a ghost town wrapped in fear. The streets were nearly deserted. Those few people who were visible moved quickly and nervously, keeping to the shadows, constantly looking over their shoulders. Their eyes followed the police vehicles with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Doors were half closed, shutters drawn. Through windows, the captain could see faces peering out, then quickly disappearing when noticed. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. Children who should have been playing evening games were nowhere to be seen. The normal sounds of village life, laughter, conversation, the clatter of cooking pots, the bleating of goats, were absent. In their place was an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the cry of a bird. Captain Sankara ordered the convoy to stop in the central square. As the vehicle's engines shut off, that silence rushed in like a flood. The captain stepped out and stood for a moment, taking in the scene. He had grown up in a place like this. He knew what a healthy village felt like, sounded like, smelled like. This place was sick with fear. Village Chief Isaka approached, flanked by several elders. His face was drawn with exhaustion and grief. The traditional responsibilities of a chief included protecting his people, maintaining order, ensuring justice. But how could he protect them from an invisible enemy? How could he maintain order when terror stalked their homes? The weight of these failures, though not his fault, showed in every line of his aged face. "Captain," the chief said, his voice hoarse, "welcome to our village, though I wish it were under different circumstances. We are grateful you have come." Captain Sankara shook his hand firmly. "Chief Isaka, I am here to help. My team and I will work day and night until we find who is responsible for these terrible crimes. But I need your help, and the help of all your people. We must work together." The chief nodded gratefully and gestured toward a building. "We have prepared accommodations for you and your men. The village will assist in any way we can. We are desperate, Captain. 5 of our women are dead. 5 daughters, mothers, sisters. Every woman in this village now fears she will be next. Every family bars their doors at night and prays until dawn. Take me to the pond," the captain said. I need to see where the bodies were found while there is still some light." The chief led the way, and the captain's team followed. Word spread quickly through the village that the police were heading to the pond, and soon a crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Their faces were a portrait of communal trauma, women with red eyes from crying, men with clenched jaws and fists, elderly people shaking their heads in disbelief, young people looking angry and frightened in equal measure. The pond lay at the edge of the village, a body of water perhaps 50 meters across, fed by a small stream. During the dry season, it was a lifeline for the community. Now it had become a graveyard, its waters tainted by death. White sheets covered 5 forms laid out on the bank. The captain approached slowly, respectfully. He knelt beside the first body and carefully pulled back the sheet. The woman was perhaps 30 years old. Her face, though marked by death, showed what had once been a beautiful, lively person. The ligature marks on her neck were clear, dark bruises in the unmistakable pattern of strangulation. Captain Sankara examined each body with professional detachment, but evident sadness. He carefully documented everything in his notebook, the positions of the bodies, the types of wounds, the estimated time in the water based on decomposition. His team photographed everything, collected water samples, searched for physical evidence, but it was clear from his examination that the killer was methodical. Each woman had been strangled. Each had been bound at the wrists, the rope or wire cutting deep into the flesh. Each showed signs of struggle. These women had fought for their lives, but their killer had been strong, determined, and skilled enough to overpower them. The marks on their wrists indicated they had been held captive, possibly for hours, before being killed. The captain's jaw tightened as he realized what this meant. These women had known their deaths were coming. They had time to be terrified, to plead, to pray, to hope desperately for rescue that never came. When he finished his examination, Captain Sankara stood and turned to the gathered villagers. His expression was a mask of professional composure, but those who looked carefully could see the deep sorrow and anger in his eyes. He raised his voice so all could hear. "People of this village," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I know you are frightened. I know you have lost friends, family members, neighbors. I know that every woman here now fears for her life, and every man fears for his wife, his daughter, his mother. This is a nightmare that should never happen in any community." He paused, making eye contact with individuals in the crowd, connecting with them as human beings, not just as an authority figure addressing subjects. "But I promise you this," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "We will bring justice. Whoever is behind this evil will not remain hidden for long. My team and I will work day and night. We will investigate every lead, question every witness, examine every piece of evidence. We will find this killer, and they will answer for their crimes. This I swear to you." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people nodded, others wept openly. These words brought a flicker of hope to their desperate situation. For the first time since the killings began, the villagers felt that perhaps someone truly cared, that perhaps help had finally arrived. An elderly woman pushed through the crowd. She was Aminata, the village's most respected elder. Her eyes, though clouded with age, still held fierce intelligence. She looked at the captain for a long moment as if taking his measure, reading his soul. "Young man," she said in a voice that carried surprising strength, "we have prayed for someone like you to come. But I must tell you, this evil is not like anything we have known before. The killer is cunning, like a spirit that moves without being seen. Be careful, Captain. Sometimes the monster wears a man's face." Captain Sankara bowed his head respectfully to her. "I will remember your words, grandmother. And I will be careful, but I will not be deterred. No matter who this killer is, no matter how clever they think they are, justice will find them." The crowd began to disperse as darkness fell completely. The captain's team set up lights around the pond and continued their forensic work into the night. Captain Sankara walked the perimeter alone, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, looking for any detail that might have been missed. He paused at the edge of the water, looking at his reflection in the beam of his flashlight. For just a moment, A smile played at the corners of his mouth. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that held something cold and satisfied. But when one of his officers called out with a question, the smile vanished instantly, replaced by his professional mask. He returned to work, the dedicated investigator, the people's protector. Yet none of them could have imagined how dark and twisted the truth really was. None of them knew that the threads of this deadly game were being pulled by hands much closer than anyone suspected. The monster the old woman warned about, the one wearing a man's face, was standing among them, wearing a badge and uniform, earning their trust even as he plotted their destruction. The first night of the investigation passed with the village under the watchful eye of police patrols. But in certain houses, women still lay awake, clutching their children, wondering if they would see the sunrise. And in the temporary headquarters, Captain Sankara sat reviewing his notes, his face illuminated by candlelight, his shadow dancing on the wall behind him like a dark twin waiting to be acknowledged. The game had begun in earnest, but it was a game with rules only one player knew, and stakes higher than anyone could imagine. Morning came with reluctant light, as if even the sun was hesitant to illuminate the tragedy that had befallen the village. Captain Sankara had barely slept, having spent most of the night organizing his team's investigative strategy. His eyes were red-rimmed but alert, his mind sharp despite the physical exhaustion. The village's narrow alleys seemed to grow narrower with each passing hour, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Though the sun climbed high in the sky, casting harsh light and dark shadows, few people ventured to the fields. The normal rhythm of agricultural life had been disrupted. Crops needed tending, but fear kept people close to their homes. Children who normally played soccer in the dusty open spaces or chased chickens through the compound now remained indoors, their laughter silenced. Mothers kept them close, unable to shake the feeling that danger could strike at any moment. Even the youngest could sense that something terrible had changed their world. Every door in the village appeared half open, half closed, as if the inhabitants couldn't decide whether to face the world or hide from it. This physical manifestation of their uncertainty, neither fully open to community nor fully closed in self-protection, perfectly captured their psychological state. The captain established his temporary headquarters in the home of village chief Isaka, a modest structure with mud brick walls and a corrugated metal roof that amplified the sound of every raindrop. Inside, on a large wooden table scarred by years of use, he spread out detailed maps of the area. Using a red marker, he circled the locations where bodies had been found, noting the distances between them, looking for patterns. "Look here," he said to his lead investigator, Lieutenant Uedraogo. "All the bodies were found in the same section of the pond. That's not random. The killer has a specific dumping spot, which means they approach from this direction." He traced a possible path on the map with his finger. Lieutenant Uedraogo, an experienced officer in his 40s, studied the map carefully. "But, sir, there are multiple paths that lead there. And in the dark, with no moon, any of them could be used without being seen." "True," the captain agreed. "But think like the killer. If you're carrying or dragging a body, you need a path that's relatively hidden, but also not too difficult to navigate. That narrows it down to here and here." He marked 2 paths with his pen. The lieutenant nodded, impressed by the logical analysis. The captain had a gift for this kind of deduction, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Throughout the morning, police and military personnel began patrolling every corner of the village. Checkpoints were established on all roads leading in and out. Though this was more for psychological reassurance than practical security, the killer, they all believed, was either a resident or had intimate knowledge of the area and its secrets. Yet despite these measures, the fear remained thick and suffocating, like smoke from a fire that couldn't be found or extinguished. The villagers simply could not believe they were truly safe. How could they, when 5 women had already been murdered despite all their traditional security measures, despite their communal watchfulness? By mid-morning, the first media vehicles began arriving. Reporters from Ouagadougou and even some from international news agencies had gotten wind of the story. They descended on the village like locusts, thrusting microphones forward, shouting questions at anyone who would listen. Cameras captured the grief-stricken faces, the abandoned streets, the atmosphere of terror that had gripped this once peaceful community. Captain Sankara had to leave his planning to address the media. He stood before them with remarkable composure, understanding that managing public perception was part of his responsibility. His uniform was crisp and clean despite the heat and dust, his boots polished to a mirror shine, though his eyes showed the strain of sleepless nights and heavy responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I will make a brief statement and then must return to the investigation. By order of President Traoré, a full and comprehensive investigation has been launched into these tragic murders. My team and I are working around the clock to identify and apprehend the perpetrator." "Captain," a reporter shouted, "do you have any suspects? Any leads? We are pursuing several lines of inquiry. I cannot discuss specifics, as doing so might compromise the investigation." "Is it true all the victims were women?" another reporter called out. "Is there a serial killer targeting women?" "All the victims thus far have been female, yes. We are investigating whether there is a specific pattern or motivation." Captain Sankara, a television reporter, pushed forward, her camera operator following. "The people want to know, how many more women will die before you catch this killer? Why hasn't the government been able to protect these citizens?" Captain Sankara's expression hardened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "Every death is a tragedy. We are doing everything in our power to prevent further loss of life. To whoever is responsible for these atrocities," he paused, looking directly into the camera lens, his eyes intense, "know this. We are closing in on you. We are examining every piece of evidence, talking to every witness, following every lead. Your days of freedom are numbered. Soon, very soon, you will face justice." The broadcast was transmitted across the nation. People in their homes, in cafes, in markets, all stopped to watch this dedicated young officer promising justice. To the terrified villagers watching on an old television in the chief's house, the captain had become a symbol of hope, perhaps their only hope in a situation that seemed hopeless. Later that afternoon, Captain Sankara conducted what would be the first of many community meetings. He gathered the village women in the chief's compound, creating a safe space for them to share their fears and information. About 30 women attended, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers. The captain sat with them, not above them, not behind a desk of authority, but in a circle as an equal, a listener. This gesture of respect and humility did not go unnoticed. In their culture, such consideration from an authority figure was rare and deeply appreciated. One by one, the women began to speak. Their stories poured out, fears for themselves and their daughters, suspicions about strangers who had been seen in the area, concerns about men whose behavior had changed. Some spoke of dreams and omens, mixing practical observation with traditional spiritual beliefs. An elderly woman named Fatih, her face deeply lined with age and worry, spoke with particular emphasis. "Captain," she said in a trembling voice, "we believe these are outsiders doing this. Bandits, maybe, or rebels from across the border. Village women are being specifically targeted. Good women, hard-working women, mothers and daughters who have done nothing to deserve this evil." Captain Sankara listened with patient attention, noting down every word in his diary. His pen moved across the page in neat, precise script. When Fatih finished, he looked at her with what appeared to be genuine compassion. "Grandmother Fatih," he said respectfully, "I promise you this. Until this matter is resolved, I will remain here among you. I will not return to the capital. I will not abandon you. My team and I will work day and night. No one will be left alone. No one will be unprotected. This is my sacred vow to you." Several women began to weep at these words. One young woman, perhaps 20 years old, reached out and touched his hand briefly. "Thank you, Captain," she whispered. "You are the first person who has made us feel like someone cares." The captain squeezed her hand gently and nodded. "I care very much," he said, and his voice carried such conviction that none of them doubted him. As night fell, Captain Sankara personally conducted patrols through the village. With a few officers accompanying him, he stopped at every hut, every dirt path, introducing himself to families, asking questions, offering reassurance. This was unusual behavior for a senior officer. Such men typically delegated such tasks to subordinates. But the captain seemed driven by a personal mission to connect with every resident. He knelt to speak with frightened children, explaining in simple terms that he was there to keep them safe. He sat with grieving families, listening to their memories of the victims. He counseled young men who were angry and wanted to form vigilante groups, explaining why that would only make the situation worse. The villagers were amazed that a government official could be so personally invested in their welfare, so genuinely caring. His dedication went beyond duty. It seemed almost like a sacred calling. They didn't know that his motivations were far more complex than simple professional obligation. "He's not like the others," people began to say to each other. "He truly cares about us. He understands our suffering." By midnight, the captain finally returned to headquarters. His officers were impressed by his stamina and dedication. Lieutenant Uedraogo brought him tea and some food. "Sir," the lieutenant said with genuine admiration, "I've never seen an officer work like you do. You haven't rested since we arrived. The people here are already calling you their protector." Captain Sankara sipped his tea, staring at the maps on the table. In the candlelight, his shadow on the wall seemed larger than life, darker, somehow threatening. But when he turned to the lieutenant, his smile was warm and humble. "These are my people," he said simply. "How can I rest when they are suffering? How can I sleep when a killer walks free?" "No, Uedraogo, I will not rest. Not until justice is done." The lieutenant nodded, moved by his commander's dedication. He left the captain alone with his maps and files. Alone in the flickering candlelight, Captain Sankara's expression slowly changed. The warmth drained from his eyes. The smile faded. He stared at the list of victims' names he had written on a notepad. Next to each name, in a personal shorthand only he understood, were small notations. His finger traced down the list. His lips moved silently, as if reciting a prayer or a curse. Then, from a locked box in his personal gear, he removed an old, worn diary. Its cover was cracked with age, its pages yellowed and fragile. He opened it carefully, reverently, reading entries written in a woman's handwriting. His mother's handwriting. Entries that chronicled her descent from hope to desperation to despair. Entries that named names, that described betrayals, that documented the systematic destruction of her life and dignity. He read one entry aloud in a whisper. "Today they laughed at me when I asked for my money back. They said I was foolish to trust them. They called me stupid in front of everyone. I have nothing left, nothing but shame. What will become of my son?" His hand clenched into a fist, crumpling the edge of the old page. Tears ran down his face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, pure and cold. "Don't worry, Mama," he whispered to the diary, to the memory, to the ghost that haunted him. "I'm keeping my promise. They will all pay. Every single one who hurt you, who laughed at you, who destroyed you. Justice is coming for them. I am justice." He closed the diary carefully and locked it away again. When his face emerged from the shadows back into the candlelight, it wore once again the mask of the concerned, dedicated investigator. No one would ever know what darkness lived behind those caring eyes. The following days fell into a grim pattern. Captain Sankara and his team worked with apparent tirelessness, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, building profiles. The captain personally reviewed every statement, every photograph, every forensic report. To all observers, he was the embodiment of dedicated police work. But on the third night after his arrival, another body was discovered. The scream came at approximately 2 a.m., shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the village. A man named Ibrahim had gotten up to relieve himself outside his compound when he stumbled upon the body of a woman lying near the edge of his property, just meters from where his family slept. The body was fresh, still warm. She had been killed within the past few hours. The same marks were present: strangulation, bound wrists, signs of struggle. But this time there was something new. On the ground next to the body, arranged with careful precision, were 7 stones. A message of some kind, though no one could decipher its meaning. Captain Sankara arrived within minutes, having been sleeping in his uniform at the headquarters. His response time was remarkable. He immediately took command of the scene, organizing his team, preserving evidence, keeping curious villagers at a safe distance. As he examined the body, his expression was one of professional concentration mixed with deep sorrow. But there was something else, something that Lieutenant Wedriogo couldn't quite identify, a flicker in the captain's eyes when he looked at the victim's face. Gone so quickly it might have been imagined. The victim was identified as Salimata Kabore, age 38, a woman who had been prominent in a women's cooperative society that had operated in the village years ago. The cooperative had collapsed under allegations of mismanagement and fraud, leaving many members destitute. This detail was recorded in the captain's notebook, underlined twice. By dawn, the village was in chaos. The fragile sense of security that the police presence had provided evaporated instantly. If a woman could be murdered within meters of police headquarters, within meters of sleeping families, then nowhere was safe. No one was protected. A crowd gathered in the village square, angry and frightened in equal measure. They shouted questions, demands, accusations. Some blamed the police for failing to protect them. Others accused their neighbors of being the killer or harboring the killer. The social fabric that held the community together was unraveling. Captain Sankara stood before them, raising his hands for silence. It took several minutes before the crowd calmed enough for him to speak. "I know you are angry," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "I know you are frightened. Another of your daughters has been taken from you, and you question whether we can protect you. These are fair questions, deserving of honest answers." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, appearing vulnerable in a way that made him more human. "More trustworthy to the watching crowd? I will not lie to you," he continued. "This killer is clever. They know this village intimately. They move like a shadow, strike like a serpent. But I promise you this, we are learning. Every crime leaves clues. Every action reveals patterns. The killer thinks they are invincible, but they are not. They are human, and humans make mistakes. When they make theirs, we will be ready," an old man called out from the crowd. "How many more must die before this happens? How many more mothers, daughters, sisters?" Captain Sankara met the old man's eyes directly. "If I could promise you no more deaths, I would. But I will not give you false comfort. What I can promise is that my team and I will not rest. We will not give up. We will pursue this investigation with everything we have until the killer is caught. This is my sacred vow." His words had a strange effect on the crowd. Instead of inflaming their anger, they seemed to channel it into something more focused. The villagers began to organize themselves, forming neighborhood watch groups, establishing systems for checking on vulnerable women, creating networks of communication. This grassroots organization was exactly what the captain suggested, guiding them subtly toward actions that would make his investigation easier while also appearing to empower them. It was masterful manipulation dressed as community development. President Traoré, receiving reports in Ouagadougou, was both impressed and concerned. The captain was showing remarkable leadership and investigation skills. The villagers trusted him completely. The media coverage was largely positive. Yet the body count continued to rise. In a secure phone call that evening, the president spoke directly with Captain Sankara. "Captain," Traoré said, his voice tired, "you are doing excellent work under difficult circumstances. The people's trust in you is clear. But we need results. The opposition is using these murders to attack my government. International media is portraying Burkina Faso as lawless. I need you to catch this killer." "Mr. President," the captain replied, his voice steady, "I understand the pressure, but rushing the investigation would be a mistake. The killer is watching us, studying our methods. If we act too quickly based on incomplete evidence, they will disappear. Give me time and I will deliver justice," Traoré sighed. "How much time?" 2 weeks. If I haven't caught the killer or made significant progress in 2 weeks, remove me from the case." It was a bold statement, showing confidence that impressed the president. "Very well, Captain. 2 weeks. But keep me informed of every development." After the call ended, Captain Sankara sat in the darkness of his temporary office. A slight smile played across his lips. 2 weeks. That was more than enough time to finish what he had started. He opened his mother's diary again, running his finger down a list of names she had written near the end, women who had betrayed her, who had stolen from her, who had laughed at her suffering. Several names were crossed out. A few remained. "Soon, Mama," he whispered. "Soon they will all answer for what they did to you." Over the next several days, Captain Sankara conducted extensive interviews with village elders, learning the history of the failed cooperative society. He discovered that 15 years ago, a group of women had pooled their resources to create a collective savings and loan program. The idea was sound. Members would contribute monthly, and the pooled money would be used to fund small businesses and help families in crisis. For a few years, it worked well. But then, under the leadership of several women, the cooperative began making increasingly risky investments. Loans were given to people who couldn't repay them. Money was used for projects that failed. When members asked for accountability, they received vague answers and promises. When the cooperative finally collapsed, hundreds of families lost their savings. Some lost everything. Among them was a widow named Mariama Sankara, the captain's mother. According to village records that the captain meticulously reviewed, Mariama had invested her late husband's life insurance money, her personal savings, and even borrowed against her small plot of land to put into the cooperative. She believed in the vision of women helping women. She trusted the leaders who spoke so eloquently about community and solidarity. When the cooperative failed, she lost everything. The land she had borrowed against was seized. She became destitute, dependent on the charity of others. The women who had led the cooperative, who had mismanaged the funds, whether through incompetence or corruption, faced no consequences. They blamed the economic situation, acts of God, bad luck. Some even suggested that members like Mariama simply hadn't understood the risks. The humiliation, the betrayal, the loss. It destroyed Mariama Sankara. According to villagers who remembered, she became a ghost of herself, barely speaking, barely eating. Her son, young Amadou, watched helplessly as his mother withered away. When she finally took her own life, hanging herself in their small house, the boy was 13 years old. He had found her body. As Captain Sankara uncovered these details he already knew but was documenting officially, he maintained perfect professional composure. He interviewed people who had known his mother, taking notes on their memories, their expressions of regret, their casual dismissals of that sad situation from years ago. One afternoon, he sat with 3 elderly women who had been peripheral members of the cooperative's leadership. They served him tea and spoke freely, having no idea that the investigator before them was Mariama's son. "It was a tragedy what happened to that poor woman," one said, shaking her head. "Mariama was always too trusting, too naive. She put in more than she could afford to lose." Another added, "Some people just don't have a head for business." The cooperative was a good idea, but it required understanding of economics that simple village women didn't have. The third woman nodded in agreement. "It's sad, yes, but these things happen. She should have been more careful with her money." Captain Sankara smiled pleasantly, writing down their words. Inside, rage burned like molten metal. These women, who had encouraged his mother to invest, who had promised her security and growth, who had mismanaged the funds, now spoke of her as if she were at fault for trusting them, as if her death were a regrettable but understandable outcome of her own poor judgment. "Did you know her son?" he asked casually. "What became of him after she died?" The women exchanged glances. "He went away," one said with a shrug. "To the city, I think." "To relatives, poor boy. But children are resilient. I'm sure he's fine now." The captain nodded, closed his notebook, thanked them for their time, and left. As he walked away from their compound, his hands trembled with suppressed fury. They didn't even remember him, didn't know who he was, didn't care what had become of the boy whose life they had helped destroy. That night, 2 of those 3 women died. Their bodies were found the next morning by the pond, arranged side by side, each with the same marks of strangulation and binding. Between them lay 14 stones, 7 for each victim. The village descended into complete panic. The killer had struck with unprecedented boldness, taking 2 victims in one night. The police had failed to protect them despite all their patrols and checkpoints. Fear turned into hysteria. Captain Sankara appeared genuinely shocked and frustrated by this development. He berated his team for failing to prevent the murders, though he himself had been the one to adjust patrol schedules that night, creating gaps in coverage. He worked frantically to examine the crime scene, looking for any clue the killer might have left. President Traoré called an emergency meeting with his security advisors. The situation was spiraling out of control. The international media was now describing Burkina Faso as unable to protect its own citizens. Opposition politicians were calling for the president's resignation. This Captain Sankara, one advisor said, is he actually competent? Or did we place our faith in the wrong man? Colonel Diallo, who had recommended the captain, defended him vigorously. Sir, Captain Sankara is working harder than any officer I've ever seen. He's in the field 20 hours a day. He's earned the complete trust of the villagers. If anyone can solve this case, it's him. But President Traoré was less certain. A troubling thought had begun to grow in his mind, a suspicion so dark he hesitated to voice it even to himself. Every time the captain reported progress, another body appeared. The killer always seemed to know where the police would be and, more importantly, where they wouldn't be. Colonel, the president said slowly, I want a complete background check on Captain Sankara. Not the standard personnel file, I want everything. Where he was born, who his family was, his complete history. Colonel Diallo looked shocked. Sir, are you suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, Traoré interrupted. I'm following my instincts. And my instincts are telling me that something about this situation doesn't add up. Do it quietly and report only to me. Yes, Mr. President. The background investigation that President Traoré ordered was conducted with utmost secrecy by his personal intelligence unit. What they uncovered sent chills down his spine. Captain Amadou Sankara had indeed grown up in a village not far from the one where the murders were occurring. His mother, Mariama Sankara, had been a victim of the failed women's cooperative. She had committed suicide when her son was 13. The boy had been sent to live with an uncle in Ouagadougou, where he had excelled in school despite his trauma. But here was the crucial detail. Birth records showed that Amadou Sankara had actually been born in the very village where the murders were now happening. His mother had moved away after her husband's death, hoping for a fresh start in a neighboring community. When the cooperative failed, she had briefly returned to the original village, where she still owned property, the abandoned house that the captain had visited so emotionally during his investigation. Moreover, the investigators discovered something else. Of the 8 women who had died, 6 had been direct members of the cooperative's leadership council. The other 2 had been prominent supporters who had publicly defended the council when questions about mismanagement arose. The stones left at crime scenes were not random. 7 stones. 7 years of his mother's suffering after the cooperative's collapse before she took her own life. 14 stones for 2 victims, 7 each. The pattern was clear. This wasn't a random serial killer. This was calculated, personal revenge. President Traoré sat in his office, the investigative report spread before him, feeling sick to his stomach. The man he had entrusted with catching the killer was the killer himself. The hero the villagers trusted was their destroyer. The officer who had sworn to protect them was executing them one by one. But the president faced a terrible dilemma. If he arrested Captain Sankara now, based on circumstantial evidence and speculation, and the captain proved innocent, it would destroy public confidence in the government and the justice system. The media would crucify them for scapegoating their best investigator. The villagers would riot, yet if he did nothing and more women died, he would be complicit in murder. President Traoré made a decision. He would set a trap, but it would have to be perfect. The captain would have to reveal himself beyond any doubt. He called Colonel Diallo to his office and explained the situation. The colonel was devastated. He had recommended the captain, vouched for him. We need to catch him in the act, Traoré said. But we can't tip him off that we suspect him. He's too intelligent, too careful. If he senses we're watching him specifically, he'll either stop killing and remain undetectable, or he'll disappear entirely. What do you propose, Mr. President? We'll announce publicly that the investigation is being scaled back. that resources are needed elsewhere. We'll make it appear that we're giving up, that the case is going cold. The captain will be told that his team is being reduced, that his time is running out. This will pressure him to act, to finish whatever list he's working through. And then we'll have undercover agents posing as potential victims. We'll watch them constantly, invisibly. When the captain makes his move, we'll have him. It's risky, sir. If something goes wrong, if an agent is hurt or killed, I know the risks, Colonel, but we're out of options. This monster has hidden himself behind a badge and our trust. It's time to expose him. The plan was set in motion. Over the next 2 days, visible police presence in the village was gradually reduced. Patrols became less frequent. Officers began packing equipment. The villagers noticed and became increasingly anxious. Captain Sankara also noticed. At a meeting with the reduced team, he appeared frustrated and upset. "They're pulling us out," he told his officers, his voice bitter. "The president has decided that we're not making enough progress. We have 3 days to show results, or the case will be transferred to another unit." His officers protested, but the captain raised his hand. I know. It's unjust, but we must work with what we have. These final days, we need to be more vigilant than ever. I will personally increase my patrols. I will not let this killer win." That evening, Captain Sankara visited the elderly woman who had been the 3rd member of the tea gathering, the one who had spoken so dismissively of his mother. Her name was Korotimi, and she lived alone in a small compound at the edge of the village. He came to her as the concerned investigator, asking if she felt safe with the reduced police presence. She welcomed him, offering him water, grateful for his attention. "You remind me of my own son," she said kindly, "so dedicated to helping others. Your mother must be very proud of you." Captain Sankara smiled. "Tell me, grandmother, about the women who have died." "Did you know them well?" "Some of them, yes. We were all part of the cooperative years ago. Such a tragedy what happened to it. And now this. Some madman killing us off one by one. Do you think it's connected?" "Connected how, grandmother?" "I don't know. It's just strange that so many victims were part of that old cooperative. But that was 15 years ago. Who would still care about that?" "Who indeed?" the captain murmured. He left her compound as night fell, promising to have officers check on her regularly. But he had already noted that her compound was in a blind spot, visible from no other houses, accessible by a path that bypassed the main patrol routes. President Traoré and Colonel Diallo, watching from a covert command post set up in a vehicle disguised as a delivery truck, saw the captain's visit on thermal imaging cameras they had secretly installed. "He's marking his next target," Colonel Diallo said grimly. "Then tonight, we end this," President Traoré replied. "Position the teams. If he returns to that compound, we take him." Elite security forces, dressed in black and equipped with night vision equipment, moved silently into position around Korotimi's compound. Inside, unknown to the old woman, a female security agent who resembled her in build and height had taken her place, while Korotimi had been quietly evacuated. The agent was armed and equipped with a panic button that would bring the entire force down on the location in seconds. The hours crawled by. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m. The teams began to wonder if the captain would act at all. But at 2:30 a.m., thermal imaging detected a figure approaching Korotimi's compound, moving slowly, carefully, checking for observers. The figure reached the compound wall, paused, then climbed over with practiced ease. Captain Sankara entered the darkened house where the agent waited, posing as the sleeping Korotimi. In his hand was a rope, the same type of rope that had been used on all the previous victims. He approached the sleeping figure and raised the rope, his hands positioning it for strangulation. His face, illuminated by faint moonlight through the window, showed no emotion, just cold determination. "For you, Mama," he whispered. "One more. Almost done." At that moment, lights blazed on from all directions. "Police, freeze! Put down the rope!" Captain Sankara spun around, shocked, as armed officers poured into the room from hidden positions. The sleeping figure sat up, revealing herself as an agent. The compound was surrounded by dozens of police and military personnel. For just a moment, the captain considered fighting, running, going down in a blaze of violence. But he was trapped, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Slowly, he dropped the rope and raised his hands. President Traoré entered the compound, his face a mask of anger and sadness. "Captain Amadou Sankara, you are under arrest for multiple counts of murder." The captain laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You're too late, Mr. President. I've already had my justice. They all paid. Every woman who destroyed my mother." "Your mother?" Traoré demanded, though he already knew the answer. "Mariama Sankara. Ring any bells?" "No, of course not. She was just another poor woman destroyed by the greed and incompetence of the cooperative leaders. She trusted them. She believed in their vision of women helping women. And they took everything from her and then blamed her for being too naive, too trusting, too stupid." He spat the words with venom. "She hung herself because of them. I found her. I was 13 years old and I found my mother hanging in our house. Do you know what that does to a child, Mr. President? Do you know how that rage grows over years, festering, demanding justice? So you became a police officer to hunt them down? To use your position to commit murder?" Traoré asked. "I became a police officer to understand how to get away with murder," Sankara corrected. "And it worked perfectly. I was the investigator investigating myself. I was the protector they all trusted while I eliminated them one by one. The irony is beautiful, don't you think?" "You killed innocent women too," Colonel Diallo interjected. "Not all your victims were responsible for what happened to your mother." "Innocent?" Sankara snarled. "They all knew what was happening. They all watched my mother suffer and did nothing. Silence is complicity. Inaction is guilt. They all deserved what they got." President Traoré stepped closer, his voice cold as ice. "Justice and vengeance are not the same thing, Captain. You had options, legal channels, investigations into the cooperative's failure, civil suits. Instead, you chose murder. You terrorized an entire village. You betrayed everything a police officer should stand for. You're not a son seeking justice. You're just a murderer with a badge." As they led him away in handcuffs, Captain Sankara showed no remorse. He looked back at President Traoré and said, "At least my mother can finally rest in peace. That's all that matters." Word of Captain Sankara's arrest spread through the village like a shockwave. Disbelief turned to horror as villagers realized that the man they had trusted, the man they had welcomed into their homes, had been the killer all along. Some refused to believe it at first, insisting there must be some mistake. But as the evidence emerged, denial gave way to a profound sense of betrayal. President Traoré held a public address in the village square the following day. The entire community gathered, their faces showing the full spectrum of human emotion: anger, grief, confusion, shame. "People of this village," Traoré began, his voice solemn, "I stand before you to acknowledge a terrible failure. The man I sent to protect you became your destroyer. The officer entrusted with finding a killer was the killer himself. For this I offer my deepest apologies and my promise that justice will be served." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I must also speak a difficult truth." Captain Sankara, former Captain Sankara, began as a victim himself. His mother, Mariama, suffered a terrible injustice here in this community 15 years ago. She cried for help and no one answered. She sought justice through proper channels and none came. She died in despair and shame, and her death planted seeds of revenge in her son's heart. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Many remembered Mariama. Some had been her friends. Others had been part of the cooperative that failed her. An elderly woman, the same Aminata who had welcomed the captain when he first arrived, stepped forward. Tears ran down her wrinkled face. "Mr. President, we are ashamed. We knew what happened to Mariama. We knew the cooperative's leaders had mismanaged the funds. We knew she lost everything, but we did nothing. We thought it wasn't our place to interfere. We told ourselves it was between her and the cooperative leadership. And in our silence, we let a tragedy unfold that has now claimed many more lives." Other voices joined hers, a chorus of guilt and recognition. The village was forced to confront its own complicity in the chain of events that led to so much death. "Silence in the face of injustice makes us all accomplices," President Traoré continued. "What happened here is a lesson for our entire nation. When we fail to speak up for the vulnerable, when we turn away from others' suffering because it's not our business, We create the conditions for tragedies like this. The captain's crimes are his own, but the soil in which his rage grew was fertilized by collective indifference. In the days that followed, the village began a painful process of healing and reflection. The pond where bodies had been dumped was filled in and transformed into a memorial garden. Trees were planted, one for each victim and one for Mariama Sankara, the original victim whose death had set everything in motion. The memorial stone bore an inscription: "Let no cry for help go unheard. Let no suffering be met with silence. Remember the cost of indifference." Captain Sankara's trial became a national sensation. Psychological experts testified about how childhood trauma can warp a person's sense of justice. Legal scholars debated the boundaries between revenge and righteous anger. The public was divided. Some saw him as a monster, others as a tragic figure driven to extremism by an unjust world. Sankara himself showed no remorse throughout the trial. He maintained that he had simply balanced scales that society had left unbalanced. "My mother was murdered by their greed and indifference," he told the court. "I merely ensured they faced consequences for their actions. If the law had worked, if justice had been served 15 years ago, none of this would have happened. The system failed my mother. I didn't fail her. He was convicted on 8 counts of premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole." As he was led from the courtroom, he looked back at the gallery where some of his former officers sat, tears in their eyes. "I'm sorry I deceived you," he said to them, "but I'm not sorry for what I did. Some debts can only be paid in blood." The village slowly recovered, though the scars remained deep. The case led to national reforms in how communities handle financial cooperatives and protect vulnerable members. Support systems were established for those facing financial ruin. The government created better mechanisms for addressing grievances before they festered into violence. But the most profound changes were in the village itself. The survivors formed a new cooperative, one built on transparency, accountability, and mutual support. They established a tradition where once a year they would gather at the memorial garden to remember all the victims, including Mariama, and to recommit themselves to watching out for one another. The story of Captain Sankara became a cautionary tale told throughout Burkina Faso and beyond. It was taught in police academies as an example of how personal vendettas can corrupt even the most dedicated officers. It was discussed in ethics classes as an illustration of how the pursuit of revenge differs from the pursuit of justice. It was referenced in community meetings as a reminder of collective responsibility. Years later, a journalist visited the village to write a retrospective on the case. She interviewed Aminata, now even more elderly but still sharp in mind and tongue. "Do you think," the journalist asked, "that if the village had helped Mariama back then, all this could have been avoided?" Aminata was quiet for a long moment, staring at the memorial garden where children now played, their laughter a sign of hope and renewal. "Yes," she said finally. "If we had helped her, truly helped her, not just offered pity and prayers, her son would have grown up differently. Pain begets pain. Injustice breeds injustice. We broke the first link in that chain through our indifference. Her son broke all the others through his rage. Both were wrong, but we were wrong first." She looked at the journalist with eyes that had seen too much. "The lesson isn't just that we should help each other to prevent revenge. It's that we should help each other because it's right, because we're human, because a community is only as strong as its compassion for its weakest members. Mariama didn't need to die. Her son didn't need to become a killer. 8 women didn't need to be murdered. All of it was preventable. All of it stemmed from that first moment when we chose silence over solidarity." The journalist wrote her article, but she found herself thinking about the case for years afterward, about how easily good people can become complicit in tragedy through inaction, about how trauma can twist a person's soul into something unrecognizable, about how the line between victim and victimizer can become blurred when the wound is deep enough and justice is denied long enough. Captain Amadou Sankara remained in prison, never showing remorse, never seeking forgiveness. He spent his days writing a memoir that no publisher would touch, documenting his mother's suffering and his calculation revenge. He maintained until his last breath that he was a son who had honored his mother's memory in the only way that mattered, by ensuring her destroyers paid for their crimes. The village prospered over time, the trauma gradually fading as younger. Generations grew up knowing only the memorial garden, not the horrors it commemorated. But once a year, on the anniversary of Mariama Sankara's death, the villagers would gather at the garden. They would speak her name aloud. They would remember not just the murders, but the original injustice that sparked them. They would recommit themselves to the lesson learned at such terrible cost, that silence in the face of suffering is not neutrality, it's complicity. And in that way, perhaps some small measure of redemption was found in tragedy. Not for Captain Sankara, whose soul had been too warped by pain to find its way back to humanity. Not even for the village, which would carry the shame of its failure forever. But for the future, for the next person who might cry out for help, and for the community that would, perhaps, remember these events and choose to answer that cry before it becomes a scream, before pain becomes rage, before a victim becomes a killer. The shadow that had fallen over the village taught them all that justice delayed is justice denied, but also that vengeance, no matter how righteously justified it feels, is never the same as justice. True justice heals communities. It restores balance. It prevents future harm. Vengeance only spreads pain, multiplying suffering until the original wrong is buried beneath layers of new ones. In the end, the tale of Captain Sankara became a mirror held up to society, reflecting uncomfortable truths about collective responsibility, the long-term consequences of indifference, and the terrible price paid when communities forget that every member's suffering diminishes them all. It was a story without heroes, only victims and villains, and the vast gray space between them where most human tragedy unfolds. And the memorial stone's inscription, "Let no cry for help go unheard," stood as both memorial and warning, a promise, and a plea carved in stone so that future generations might build a world where justice truly meant healing rather than revenge, where community meant solidarity rather than convenient silence, and where no child would ever again have to watch helplessly as a parent was destroyed by others' greed and indifference. That, perhaps, was the only redemption possible from such darkness. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but learning. Learning to be better, to do better, to answer the call for help before the silence becomes complicity and complicity becomes tragedy. The shadow had fallen. But in its darkness, the village had finally learned to see what they had been blind to before, that their fates were intertwined, that one person's suffering would eventually become everyone's suffering, and that the only true safety came not from locks and walls and police patrols, but from the simple act of caring for one another before it was too late. This was the legacy of the shadow, a lesson written in blood, carved in stone, planted in trees that would grow for generations to come, bearing silent witness to the truth that justice and revenge are not the same, that silence is not neutrality, and that every choice to turn away from another's suffering plants seeds that will one day grow into thorns. The end.